All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, May 27th, 2016, President Obama offered remarks in which he said, quote, 71 years ago on a bright, cloudless morning, death fell from the sky and the world was changed. These were his remarks at Hiroshima, the site of the first atomic bombing, the bomb dropped by the U.S. on the city that killed an estimated 140,000 people. 3 days later, the U.S. would bomb Nagasaki, killing 80,000 people. The vast majority of those killed, of course, were civilians. Now Obama was in Hiroshima 71 years later to offer remarks and an apology of sorts. He and Prime Minister Shinzo Abe visited the memorial, laid a wreath, and after the speech, Obama met briefly with survivors of the Hiroshima attack who had been sitting in the audience during his remarks. So, here to discuss Obama's Hiroshima visit, why it took this long, and this president to be the first to visit and offer remarks of this kind, and a little bit on the larger context of presidential apologies, are, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Columbia and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hi, Jody.
Hey there.
We did an episode fairly recently about the Tuskegee experiments, and it was hooked to Bill Clinton offering an apology for those actions by the U.S. government. And, you know, towards the end, we were kind of talking about what kind of apology was it? How forceful was it? And, you know, I'll just start by saying Clinton in his remarks around Tuskegee says, quote, "We cannot stop turning our heads away. I want to be clear. What we did was shameful, and I am very sorry." NIki, you study the Obama presidency. You'll guide us through kind of a lot of how this came together. But in terms of the kind of apology, or if even that's the right word, how do Obama's remarks at Hiroshima stack up on that sort of spectrum of forceful acknowledgement and apology?
I'm not even sure you would use the word acknowledgement, except to say that it's an acknowledgement that a terrible, terrible thing was done. But a lot of passive voice is doing the work when it comes to this statement. Because it's certainly, Barack Obama was someone who had been very forceful about nuclear nonproliferation. It was a core cause for him. It was something that well predated his run for the presidency, even his run for Senate. So it was something that he cared about. And so I'm not surprised that he wanted to go to Hiroshima and talk about what I would describe as what a terrible crime against humanity it was. But because he's president of the United States, he can't say that. The American people still mostly support the decision to use nuclear weapons. And so he kind of has to thread the needle of public opinion, wartime norms, and his desire to recognize what happened and how horrifying it was.
But when you say he can't say that, he can't offer a sort of forceful apology or a straightforward apology, why? Is there a political dynamic there, or is there a precedent-setting dynamic there? I mean, what's going on?
Yeah, there is a political dynamic there. I mean, it's essentially this, that unlike with the Tuskegee experiment, where it is the U.S. government doing something to innocent people kind of out of nowhere, not out of nowhere, out of, centuries of racism, but...
And for no reason.
Right. In this case, the U.S. is at war with Japan, and Japan started the fight, right? Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. The U.S. was drawn into the war by those actions, which is not to say that dropping the bombs wasn't a crime and wasn't horrific, but it is in the context of this war where Japan had been the aggressor. And so the kind of dynamics of that make it difficult, I think, for him to say, we're sorry. Certainly the presence of people who had fought in World War II still alive and in active lobby in the United States makes it difficult. And then the American people didn't want to apologize. And I think that the combination of those things really held him back.
I also think there's so much in American culture that prohibits people from apologizing because it's read as a form of weakness. Yeah. And it's read as, as it should be, an acknowledgement of culpability, like an acknowledgement that I have caused harm, I have done something wrong. And Americans are very averse to admitting or confessing to any kind of wrongdoing. An apology is really the way that you acknowledge a harm that's been committed.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned Pearl Harbor, obviously, as part of the context here. I happen to have looked it up, but in December of that year of 2016, Shinzo Abe visits Pearl Harbor, but he was the fourth Japanese prime minister to visit Pearl Harbor. The visits beforehand, though, had all been kind of very quiet. And, he was the first to kind of give remarks, but then he offers, I think, would be characterized as more acknowledgement of the harm that was done. But again, Japan was the aggressor there. The political dynamic here, though, is interesting. A lot of what you work on with the Obama Oral History Project, Nikki, but remind us this idea of Obama and apology was not a those words often were used together, especially in the 2008 election, right? Or in the 2012 election. So, tell us kind of why this is particularly fraught for this particular president.
Right. It is not something that came up for the first time in 2016. Obama had constantly been criticized for his engagement with the world under the framework of, he's apologizing for the United States. This was something that was said about his trip to Egypt to give a speech in 2009. It was something that was kind of used as a framework for his entire foreign policy. And Mitt Romney in 2012, when he's facing off against Obama in the presidential campaign, Mitt Romney says that that's how Obama approaches foreign policy. He goes on apology tours instead of looking out for, let's say, America first.
I feel like apologizing for stuff is a sign of strength. How does Obama react to that? Does he try and thread the needle, or how do they play that politically?
I mean, I think he's absolutely threading the needle, because he's not coming out and saying, we apologize for the wrong done. It's more like, this was a tragedy. Bad things happened in this place, things that we don't ever want to happen again. And while I think that's understandable to say that, it's not explicit at all in who caused harm or who is culpable. Obama says that, when he's giving a speech in this at this park that is a place to really honor those who died during the bombings, he uses this quote to urge the world to choose a future when Hiroshima and Nagasaki are not considered the dawn of atomic warfare, but the start of our own moral awakening. And in some ways that sounds very beautiful, and it is, but at the same time, it does not explicitly acknowledge who was at fault.
Yeah. And a lot of this comes out of very careful negotiations where both sides, especially because, maybe not because they're allies, but the U.S. and Japan have been very close for a long time since the war ended. And it's a careful negotiation to, neither side really apologizes, but they begin to express kind of a shared interest in moving forward toward the goal of, if not a nuclear-free world, then a less nuclearized world, and to continue to be partners both in economic relations but also security relations. So there's a real effort to find equivalence, or to make sure that they're kind of both on the same page and doing just as much as the other.
Yeah, and no surprise, but I guess I've sort of, during if I'm being honest, during the Trump era, you kind of forgot what careful diplomacy looked like. And so that was part of what I was thinking, just like reading back here, just sort of how careful all of this was orchestrated, how for years that had been building to this moment. And, Obama, I think we hinted at it, had talked about kind of wanting to do this even during the 2008 campaign, and then probably felt the ability to, probably took teams and teams of people negotiating over years. And then, just to paint a picture of kind of how fraught this is diplomatically, there is a whole through line of, criticism of Japan of never fully acknowledging their role in the war, and Japanese leaders minimizing their role in the war, particularly from China. And now this moment here, China criticizes the United States for doing this, for not sort of holding Japan accountable for their role and minimizing their role, and so obviously, like, I can just imagine the statecraft that went into this and the competing diplomatic interests, which, I go back and forth. On the one hand, some of that stuff feels like just diplomats being overthinking it, and some of it is also feels incredibly fraught, because one little wrong word in Japan, if it pisses off China, then all of a sudden, it's a whole thing.
The fact is, everyone should be apologizing, right?
Thank you. You should work at the State Department.
Sorry. The United States should be saying sorry. Neither countries do. Japan does not ask for an apology. Japan does not apologize. Neither does Obama. But I also think part of the reason we don't apologize is because we expect that along with apology comes reparations, or comes some sort of, like, you can't just say, I'm sorry, I stole your bike. You have to give the bike back. You have to somehow or here's cash for a new bike, or whatever. Like, we don't know how to make amends or repair damages that have been caused. And so an apology feels like, well, if you offer an apology, then what's next? And that's what I think Americans, not just Americans, but a lot of people get terrified when people start throwing around apologies. People feel like they have to start opening up pocketbooks as well.
Right.
There's also an aspect to this in trying to find the right balance, is that American and Japanese opinion about these events are just very different. The majority of Americans think that the U.S. did the right thing in using nuclear weapons at the end of the war. In Japan, 8 out of 10 people see the bombings as unjustified. And so how do you negotiate those very, very different opinions? And one of the things is worth noting that President Obama does is that he meets with survivors. Now, survivors were hoping for an apology. They understood in advance that they weren't going to get one, but they did have a chance. They did have a chance to meet with the president and shake hands with him and talk to him. And that kind of personal connection, it's not an apology. It's not enough, but it's something. And I think that it was a meaningful moment for both President Obama and for those survivors.
And I think where there is agreement is that both parties can agree that nuclear warfare is awful, and that we should move away from it as far as we possibly can.
Yeah. So that's exactly where I think it's worth ending. I'm curious, NIki, just you're working on this project where you're looking back at the Obama presidency. How much was nuclear nonproliferation priority for the presidency? How much did their efforts meet or fall short of their goals? And kind of how much is it part of the Obama legacy or non-legacy?
So it is certainly part of his biggest foreign policy achievement, and people can decide whether they think it's a good one or a bad one, but the Iran nuclear deal comes out of this desire to prevent Iran from nuclearizing. And that's important. There are talks with North Korea. They don't go that well, but he pursues it on that front. But for something that I really do believe was a core commitment and a core passion for Barack Obama when he took office, he does surprisingly little on it. And I think part of that speaks to how difficult it is. Part of it speaks to how much you're juggling as president. You can only spend so much time on any issue. He comes into office in the middle of a crisis. One of the statistics is that he reduces nuclear stockpiles the least of any post-Cold War president. And, there are the easy nukes to get rid of were gotten rid of before he came into office, but he really doesn't make a ton of progress on it. And so that's a puzzle, I think, for historians going forward, is why, given that he cared so much about this, he was able to do so little on it.
And then politically, how much do you think this Obama apologizes for being American kind of colored his legacy, and how much did it play into the 2016 election? I mean, was that something that seemed like it stuck around?
It certainly stuck in conservative circles. It was something where, like, Sarah Palin was on the campaign trail for Donald Trump in 2016 talking about Obama dissing the vets by going over to Hiroshima and what she called his apology tour. So this idea that he was going on and apologizing, you would always see these memes circulating of Obama bowing to foreign leaders, and that was held out as, oh, Obama doesn't respect America. He's not proud of America. He's always
weakness,
apologizing.
that this is always weakness. Yeah. Or subservience. Oh, you're somehow subordinating yourself to other countries.
Yeah.
And that idea of weakness versus strength, that's something that President Obama's successor played on a lot in the campaign trail and in office.
Yeah, and I think, the sort of underlying thing of Make America Great Again was a lot of just sort of, we don't take as a given that we are the greatest country on earth anymore, and we do all this sort of mealy-mouthed, weak apologizing. And so, yeah, I'm sure that was certainly out there, I think, for sure. Okay, well, that brings us to the end of the episode. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
And we should just say, as we're going, if anyone is listening from New York, Oprah-demics, Kellie's podcast, is doing, and our sister podcast, is doing a live event in New York at the Tribeca Film Festival. Kellie, what's that date?
June 15th at 5:30. Tickets are on sale now. So if you are in or around the New York City area, come. We want to see you. It will be a great time with Leah and Wesley Morris as our special guest.
And I'll be there too, and you can come say hi. Yes, check that out, and we'll post that on social and all that stuff. But yes, Oprah-demics live event. We are spreading the word June 15th.
Radiotopia. From